Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in the part 3 of our 3-part series on writing a grant evaluation for a proposal. If you've been on the other 2 webinars, then you're familiar with this housekeeping item. Want to make sure that we're answering your questions, so please use the question function on your computer. And we have with us our fabulous intern, Elise Hopes, who will help to moderate the Q&A portion. And let me introduce myself as well. I'm Lana Rux. I am principal consultant of the Rux Group, and we're a research and evaluation firm that gathers, analyzes, and interprets data to enable our clients to measure the impact of their work. We were formed in 2008, and over the past several years, we've worked primarily with higher education institutions on grants funded by federal agencies such as the National Science Foundation, Department of Education, and Department of Labor. Now, the purpose of this webinar series is really wrapped around 3 objectives. One, I wanted to provide an organizing framework to be able to understand the various evaluation terms that are often used. And then I also wanted to provide a formula for writing evaluation plans. And then taking that together really was hoping to reduce the evaluation angst. And then towards those 3 objectives, making sure that we're answering your questions. So again, make sure to use that question function. So let's get started by a quick recap of what we went over in the last webinar. In the last webinar, I reinforced a framework for thinking about an evaluation plan that was really centered around 6 elements. The first 2, which are the foundations, which we covered at the beginning of the month, focused on the theory of change and evaluation questions. The next 2 that we focused on the last webinar is focused on evaluation design, data gathering, and analysis. And then in this final piece, the finale, we're going to focus in on use of findings as well as the operational approach. So in thinking about these 6 elements, what I want you to think about is that when writing an evaluation plan for varying scales of projects, not to necessarily eliminate one of those elements, but just provide less details and less information. So a small scale evaluation may just have a sentence around each of those elements, whereas a large scale evaluation may have a paragraph or much more detail. So also last time, we introduced step 3 of the formula. And in step 3, we talked about choosing an evaluation design that's going to be appropriate to the context and the level of resources that you're using. And towards that end, we provided the comparison of a number of common evaluation designs and some of the considerations in thinking about what design you want to use, like the extent to which it addresses internal validity, the implementation resources, and things of that nature. And then we also talked about the fact that these design approaches really vary in the extent to which we can conclude that A caused B, or the extent to which they are able to effectively address internal validity. The other element that we talked about last time was in regards to the data gathering process. So step 4 talked about considering what you're gathering, how you're gathering it, and when you're gathering it, and then describing how you'll analyze it. We talked about data gathering strategies and what types of data can be gathered using from a qualitative and a quantitative standpoint. And then we also introduced the idea of a data matrix. And in the data matrix that you're able to present out a lot of information that will connect the evaluation questions as well as the data gathering and the analytical approach together. So essentially, the take-home lesson here is that if that was a quick recap of that information, then I invite you to go back to our YouTube page and review the previous webinars so that you can digest that information at your own pace. And I am going to pause here for a question. And the question I'm going to pause for actually was originally proposed right after the last webinar, so it didn't get aired during the webinar, but I thought it was a good question. So, Elise, would you be able to read out what that question was?
Yes, that question was, do you include your data matrix and NSF proposals which have such tight page limits?
Yes, we do. And I thought that was a good question because with any of these elements that we're talking about, there's a real practical component, which is you have to think about the spacing and the space limitation associated with it. And so, yes, I do include the data matrix in the NSF grants that we propose or that we are written into. And I should say, though, that sometimes it takes a lot of creativity to get the data matrix in terms of just making sure that it fits within the amount of space that's been allotted for the evaluation plan. But what I've also found is because there's so much information that's available within that data matrix that I can actually sacrifice some of the words that I would have used to describe what's actually being included within that table. So I thought that was a great question, so thank you for asking that. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started on the fourth element, and that's use of evaluation findings. I think that's important kind of if you want a way of conceptualizing these different elements. The first four elements you can think of as the bricks. And these last two around use of evaluation findings and the operation approach, it's more like the mortar. It's what's going to pull everything else together. Those first four may be a little more difficult, a little more inaccessible to kind of think about. But these last two, I think, are a little more intuitive, although it may kind of challenge the way that you think about evaluation just a little bit. So let's go ahead and jump in and I'll show you what I mean. So in thinking about use of evaluation findings, there are really two primary uses for the evaluation findings. They're either going to be related to proving or related to improving. Proving is focused in on accountability. It's focused on did you do what you say you were going to do? Did you retain the students that you said you were going to retain? Did you graduate the number of students that you said you were going to graduate? Improving is much more focused in on the continuous improvement process. So in improving, you're much more focused in on, well, how can we get better at retaining individuals? How can we get better at graduating individuals? And what's nice about these two purposes is that they're interconnected with each other. And so the way that I think about proving and improving is I think of proving being nested within improving. And so that if you're focused in on the improving component, you're going to take care of the proving piece. So let me give you an example of that. So over the course of this webinar series, one of the examples that we've been reviewing is related to a Department of Labor tech grant that we worked on. And in this grant, the purpose was to be able to recruit individuals who would need additional certifications, and particularly in mechatronics as a mechatronics technician. And one of the goals, of course, was to actually give people credentials. They needed to be retained and they needed to actually complete the program so they could earn their credentials. So early on within the project, we were gathering a lot of different information, but one of the things that we started to look at was actual retention data. To what extent were people being retained and completing the project? And people were enrolled in this project through cohorts. So there were about 15 people in 24 cohorts over about a year and a half time frame. So looking at the first four cohorts, These were our findings. Not really a clear pattern here. Really weren't sure how to interpret these findings. But we were talking with the project. We were regularly engaged. We were gathering data from students and getting feedback from them and from instructors. And as we started looking at this more clearly, we realized instead of organizing the data in this format, we needed to organize it this way by putting cohorts 1 and 3 together and cohorts 2 and 4. Why is that? Well, it started to become apparent was that people who were in the odd cohorts, those were the day cohorts. And so they were enrolled in the program during the day, and they had slightly different characteristics than those who were enrolled in the evening cohorts. Different motivations, different level of educational background as well. And so in looking at that and understanding the demographic information, the project team was able to implement a number of different support services for them. And so they were able to identify and isolate out some services that would have been supportive in terms of maintaining retention. So if we looked at just the trend of those 2 first cohorts, what we would have seen off of those first 2 cohorts for those enrolled in the day program would have been at 47%. But with those additional support services, the remaining cohorts had a retention rate closer to 61%. And even though these initiatives or those additional supports were really being targeted for people in the day program, they also were implemented for the evening. And there too, we saw an increase from 71% for those first 2 cohorts to 79%. So what's really encouraging around this is that they were able to improve on the proving piece because they were focused on continuous improvement. So what does that look like in practice in terms of what you're actually supposed to look like in terms of interacting with an evaluator or with the evaluation? So if you think about the life cycle of a project, there's all these moments where there are decision points that are occurring. And very often, the evaluation or the involvement of the evaluator is not linked to where those decisions are actually occurring. And when you have a much more continuous improvement mindset, mind frame, is that now what you're going to make sure that you're doing is to sync up the involvement of the evaluator or the evaluation when those decision points are actually occurring. So I go into greater depth on this whole role of continuous improvement in a webinar that we actually hosted in April of this year. So again, if you go to our YouTube page, you can go and review that. And also, we will have a webinar in September that's focused on developmental evaluation, which deals in greater depth around this idea as well. But for these purposes, what I want to emphasize is part of step 5. You want to make sure that you're including a statement that's talking about how the evaluations are going to be used for continuous improvement, and then the reporting for that much more kind of proving component. And this is really simple. Here again is another example that we've been using throughout this webinar series. It was a Department of Education grant. It's a small scale grant. And here, as you can see, we just have a summary statement about how the evaluation findings are going to be summarized in the report, shared with the project team, but also how formative evaluation findings will be used to inform the refinement of project activities. In a similar vein, here's another example that we've been using throughout the webinar series. This was another Department of Education grant, and it's a moderate scale. And again, what you'll see is a statements around the reporting and continuous improvement purposes for the evaluation findings, and that the external evaluator will be working with the project team for recommendations for project modifications throughout the project's life cycle. So take-home lesson here is just summarize how evaluation findings will be used for continuous improvement and reporting purposes. Very simple sentences or statements that need to be included. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions.
Hi, Lana. We do have a question. Where does the information regarding the use of evaluation findings in the evaluation plan go?
Okay, good question. So it really depends a little bit on the the grant and what you're saying with the other data gathering processes. Generally, it's not at the very beginning. Sometimes I will include it within after I've talked about the data gathering process. I will talk about the use and how that information will be used. And then sometimes I may just incorporate it towards the end when talking about the operational approach. So I think part of the decision is the length of the evaluation plan. If it's a little shorter and there's less information in the data gathering process, I will include it there so it won't get lost. But if there's more detail in data gathering, then I may put that in the operational approach. There's some flexibility, but it depends slightly on the context of that particular proposal. So, good question. Well, let me continue on to the next piece, the operational approach. And this is the final piece of the formula. And in this piece, what you want to make sure that you're focusing in on are the practical aspects of the evaluation. How the evaluation is going to actually be operated and how it's actually going to be implemented from a practical standpoint. Okay. And so for step 6, when you want to make sure you describe who will be involved in the evaluation and also the timing of those evaluation activities. So who are some of the individuals that are usually involved in the evaluation? Well, of course, you have the principal investigator who would be involved. But another person that you want to engage with is the institutional researcher. And it's also really important that you engage with the institutional researcher during the proposal phase. One, they may have real insight in terms of what will impact on the data gathering process. And so you want to make sure that that is reflected within the narrative. But also, they may also have a need for additional resources to be able to gather the needed data. And so you want to make sure that that is captured so it's reflected in the budget during the proposal phase as well. You also just may have some other stakeholders who are involved within the process too. Some of these other stakeholders could be a co-PI, another project team member, or somebody else within the institution, or maybe another partner. And so those are some other individuals that you want to make sure to involve within the evaluation. And then, of course, there's also the external evaluator. And at its best, what you want to do is be able to work on a collaborative standpoint with these individuals. And that you're collaboratively thinking about and implementing the evaluation, particularly again with that lens towards continuous improvement. And sometimes what you'll see as a term to refer to this group of individuals is an evaluation team. And let me take a moment here just to talk a little bit about the role of the external evaluator. Now, an external evaluator should be providing guidance in the development of the evaluation. And of course, they also should be leading the implementation of the evaluation. But again, as I've said, that the implementation should really ideally occur within this collaborative standpoint. But I also think that the external evaluator, should be the champion for the evaluation. And I put champion in quotation marks because it's a champion for the evaluation, not the project per se. So what do I mean by championing the evaluation? Well, you want someone who is really looking for ways to learn through the continuous improvement process. You also want someone who's really staying what I call close on the project to be able to identify emergent data gathering processes that may not have been clear before the project was actually being implemented. And then you also want to make sure that there's someone who's helping to catalyze the process for using the data to inform the decision-making process. And again, basically what they're doing is really helping to use the evaluation for this continuous improvement and not just for the proving piece. And I think in that way, there's a lot of value that an external evaluator can give to a project beyond just being able to check a box to say that there's an external evaluator who's serving on the project. So in regards to talking about the team, what does this look like? Again, very simple statements that can be included within the narrative. So in this case, we just give a description of our firm, who's leading the evaluation, and then who's going to be involved. So here it was a project director and an institutional researcher. And again, similarly, in another example, we talked about the PI, the co-PIs who would be involved, giving information about myself and the firm. And again, depending on the space, you can provide more detail or less detail around these elements. Another piece that you could consider to add into the evaluation plan would be a reference to the cycle of evaluation activities. And what you want to be able to do is convey that the evaluation is not something separate, but it's integral to the project. And so on this type of example, we're highlighting out when the evaluation design is going to be articulated, the data gathering, as well as when reporting is going to occur. And then also this image also is conveying that we're meeting frequently. Most of the time in working with our clients, we minimally are trying to meet with clients once a month because we do deal with these innovative new projects. And there are a lot of emergent issues that we want to make sure that we're capturing information so that we know that that's occurring. And also if we can identify ways to capture additional data. So the take-home lesson here is really describe who will be involved in the evaluation and when the evaluation activities will occur. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions.
Yes, we do have a few questions. The first one is, what if you can't hire an evaluator during the proposal phase?
Yes, that's actually, that's not an uncommon challenge. I know that some institutions, what they will do is they will actually create a pool of an evaluators that are pre-qualified, that they are able to reach out to when a grant opportunity emerges. If that's not feasible, then you can just include within the evaluation plan what your procurement process will be to secure an evaluator. If you have to do that latter approach, what I would encourage you to do is just to make sure that as soon as you are getting started on that process, that you're actually securing an evaluator. Again, I really believe that the value that an evaluator can bring is through the continuous improvement process. And if you wait too long to be able to engage with an evaluator, then that benefit gets weakened. So make sure that you're able to secure that person early within the process.
Thanks, Lana. We have another participant who asked, do you have any tips for working with institutional researchers who are unresponsive?
It depends on how and when they're unresponsive. So unresponsive can occur in different ways. So one of the reasons why I encourage individuals to reach out really early within the process is so that the project is on their radar. So are they unresponsive because the project's not on their radar, you haven't been able to reach out to them, and you're needing something turned around very quickly. I think that's one type of situation. But at the heart, I think, of the solution is really building a relationship with the individual, making sure that you are reaching out to that person, finding time to meet with that person before you really need them to provide you with data. The earlier you can do that, and then to find out what would make that person's job easier. What would they need so that it would be easier for them to give you the data that you needed. In many institutions, they're one person that's being asked to do a lot in really quick turnaround times. So the more that you kind of are reaching out to them before you need something from them, the more that you have a relationship and the more that you know that you're giving them something that you'll be able, that your reach out is in a frame or in a way that they will be able to more quickly respond to. So hopefully that helps as a quick tip. And then the bottom line is just persistence. Sometimes you just have to be really persistent. So
Thank you, Lana. We do just have a couple of more questions.
okay, would I be able to pause for a quick moment so I can finish, just to make sure that we are able to get everything in?
Sure.
Okay, so I will go through this next portion quickly and we'll try to make sure that we have that time at the end. So quickly, just in terms of putting everything together, we started off by the foundations and we talked about the theory of change. And with the theory of change, we said to be able to summarize that in a sentence and to be able to include a logic model at the proposal stage for moderate and large scale initiatives. Then we also talked about that every proposal should have evaluation questions, and that what really is going to vary is not the presence or absence, but the number of those questions. Then we talked about choosing evaluation design, and then what you need to consider in terms of the data gathering and analysis and describing that. And the final two in regards to the use of the findings and the operational approach. And so when you put all those together, what you'll get is an evaluation plan. And so we started this journey together talking about the evaluation word salad. And we talked about all these different words that may not be necessarily clear or understanding. And hopefully after this time together, there's a little more clarity on where these terms actually land and where they actually live. So hopefully that aims and the objectives that we had have been met. And so just real quickly, I did talk about the next webinar, which is focused on developmental evaluation. That's going to occur on September 10th. So let me stop there and return back to the questions that have been posed.
Thanks, Lana. One participant's question is, what would you say the key thing is that we need to be aware of to create the logic model effectively?
I think there needs to be an understanding of what the underlying theory is. And theory is not theory in regards to, a grand scientific theory, but every project, there's an underlying hypothesis that you are operating from. And a lot of times that underlying theory is not necessarily been articulated. The more that you articulate that piece and really going back to that if then and really understanding what your theory is around recruiting, around retaining individuals, be it underrepresented minorities or women, the more you have an understanding of that theory, then I think that then the logic model becomes much clearer about what activities do you need to do to make that theory really come alive, and then what outcomes you will see by actually implementing that theory. So hopefully that kind of makes sense in terms of really focusing on the theory piece.
Thank you. And then just one more to wrap up. Will it be better to involve an external evaluator for a larger grant like $1 million versus 100,000?
It depends. I don't know if I would say better. It's definitely usually involving an external evaluator. It's usually just as you technically are not doing a percentage of the grant, but sometimes you use it as a guide. So relatively speaking, it's going to be a percentage of the grant, although that's not technically how you would determine what the costs are. There really could be some capacity building, and that what you want to do in terms of engaging with an evaluator with a $100,000 grant is to really help to play a consultant role, that you may have some people internally who may be able to do some of the data gathering processes to just try to make that engagement more cost effective. But it may really be useful to be able to engage with someone to help in terms of capacity building, evaluation capacity building, and grant capacity building to be able to get to a larger grant. So I don't think that I would completely shy away from talking to an external evaluator, even if it was a small grant. You may just scale down what their involvement is, and they may just play a stronger consultative role than actually doing all the data gathering components. So I believe that we are at time. Thank you all so much for joining in. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We have the webinars that are posted on our YouTube page, and you will receive an email tomorrow with the link to the recording as well as a survey. So if you can complete that survey and let us know what your experience is so that we can keep getting better, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.